Hello, hello again, and welcome to Talk Taboo to Me. I am your host, Krista.
I am the other host, Tracie, and today we have with us a very special guest, Mandi Zucker, the Executive Director of End of Life Choices New York. And Mandi, you have 25 years of experience working in the field of death and dying, and is coming today to bring us a bunch of very interesting information and things that we can talk about today. So thank you so much for being here, Mandy.
Thank you for having me.
Yes. So let's just jump right in. I think a good question to start with really is, what do you think defines a good death, and how does assisted dying fit into that idea?
It's a great question. I've thought about that kind of a question a lot. I don't know if I can define what a good death is. And that's probably because my definition is different than yours. Different from, you put 10 people in a room and 10 people are going to have a different answer what a good death looks like. What I think it includes is choice and some control if it's possible. It's not always possible. But what a good death looks like for me, I'll say, I'm 52 years old and healthy, and I don't think that I'm dying anytime soon, although you never know. So at this moment, for me, a good death would look like being surrounded by my family, maybe, my favorite foods or smells right before it happens, some good music. I love my bed. I would want to be in my bed. But for you, it might look different. I mean, it could look very different. You could say, I want to be, kept alive at, all costs. I want to be surrounded by doctors and machines. And that is the exact opposite of what I would want. But for you, that might be exactly what you want. So it's really hard to say what a good death looks like. I think it's so personal and individual. And as
Yeah.
far as assisted deaths, that sort of plays into it because it's about autonomy. So if I know I'm dying and I'm not going to be hit by a bus tomorrow and I'm diagnosed with an illness and I know that I have a certain amount of time and I want to hasten my death by, not so that I don't have to suffer at the end of my life, that plays into it because if that's my choice and that's what I want, and I get to decide how much suffering, either physical, psychological, emotional, I want to tolerate, assisted death could play a role in that.
Makes
I
sense. That makes a
absolutely
lot.
love, yeah, I love your answer. And, was thinking about just even the concept of a good death. Your answer was just so different than even what I was thinking, because I was actually
Hmm.
thinking about the dying experience. And I could
Okay.
see how individuals who are dealing with, the terminal illness and everything and thinking about the death and dying in peace. And for me, I was like, I just want it to be quick. I don't want to be in pain. I
Yeah.
want to
Yeah.
fall asleep. And I would love to be able to tell my kids my last words, like, I love you. But the way that you described it was so beautiful. And I think that that's just a really neat reminder that down to the core, we have very different ideas of what the death and dying process would be. And you mentioned something that
Yeah.
I actually want to ask you about, and you mentioned the autonomy piece. And so I'm curious, do you believe that there is autonomy over one's own death? Like that's a fundamental human right? Or are there moral boundaries that should limit it?
It's a really good, difficult question.
Yeah.
I don't think I could say it's one or the other. I do think that we all have or should have autonomy over our own bodies. And I also feel like there is a greater good. That's why personally, I care about vaccines. I care about wearing, not driving drunk. I think, there's choice. And we should all have choice. And yet there is a public safety to ourselves and to others that we also need to be aware of. So I do think that there should be autonomy over our deaths. And what that means is that if we know we're dying, I do think that we should have some control over the timing and the location and, the people that we're with.
Uh-huh.
And I also think that there does need to be some boundaries. Um, And thankfully in this country, there are. Other people disagree with me. I don't think, I come from a mental health background. So, I've worked in suicide prevention, and I don't think that anybody should just say, I'm ready to die now, and should be allowed to do that. Some people feel differently. And there are
Yeah.
people that feel like we should all have complete control over whether we live or die. I've known too many people that have died by suicide, and I just know that those people, if we were able to have stopped them and they thought about it for 30 more seconds, a week, a month, they would still be alive because they would have chosen
Yeah.
something different. So I personally think that there should be boundaries. I'm glad that we live in a country that does have boundaries over assisted dying, but I do think that we should have some autonomy over our deaths.
Yeah. Oof.
I agree. And be aware of what those choices might be or might not be. I have spent a lot of time with at the end of life with my various family members, and I've always been very mindful to ask, like, is there something that you want, you don't want? Can I do? Can I get you a meal? Like, is there a thing that I can do for you? And then
Mhm.
watching other family members come in and who feel differently than maybe what that person expressed they want, because for personal reasons, their spouse wants them to have an intervention that they don't want, or their
Yep.
child,
Oh.
or my sibling, or somebody else is like, no, no, we're absolutely going to do the thing. And so I can just see where this just causes massive issues. So I'm glad that there are like ways for people to talk about it. But I also like that we're
Mhm.
talking about what kinds of options there are, because I have
Yes.
just seen this go south many times.
Mhm.
Can you say a little bit about how like laws and in different countries, different states around assisted suicide, sort of how they've evolved, how they're different, what we can learn from those differences, maybe?
Yep. So first of all, I'll say we don't say assisted suicide. We say assisted death. And we do that
Yeah,
on purpose
that makes
because there's a lot
Yeah.
of confusion out there about the differences between suicide and medical aid and dying. And I can have a whole conversation with you about what the difference is. But anyway, I'm not, particularly an expert on the laws in other countries or honestly, even in other states. But the United States and most of the states that have allowed for medical aid in dying have a pretty consistent law. There's a few differences. New York's law is about to be signed by Governor Hochul. That's where I advocate. And it's slightly different than every other state. But generally speaking, in this country, in order to qualify for medical aid in dying, you have to have a terminal diagnosis with a prognosis of 6 months or less. You have to be an adult. You have to be competent
Mhm.
to make the decision that this is what you want, and you have to be able to self ingest the medication.
Mm.
No doctor can give you a shot or force the medication in you somehow. You have to be able to take it yourself.
okay.
Wow.
That makes sense.
Mhm.
Wow.
Assisted dying, actually, I appreciate the difference in the
Yeah.
language of that. It sounds
It's because
different.
we hear from, literally everyone that I've ever spoken to around the country that wants to utilize medical aid in dying want to live. Like all of them want to stay alive, but they don't have that option. They know that they are going to die and they just want to take control over that experience. It's different with suicide. So people that, end up dying by suicide are in pain. They have mental health issues that have not been addressed or addressed well enough. It's
Mhm.
very different than somebody that wants to hasten their death because they're dying and just want to avoid suffering. I always say what medical aid in dying does is shortens death. It doesn't shorten life. Suicide
Yeah.
shortens life, right?
Good
Yeah.
distinction.
And right before us, you know, recording this, I told you, I was like, I feel like I'm about to get my mind blown. And you just did right there. Like, I'm going to say I'm speechless. And then I'm one of those people that just can't shut up. I'm speechless, but have so many thoughts and so many things that I want to say. Like, wow, that is because you said it right there that these individuals who are doing assisted death, I mean, first of all, that vernacular of changing suicide to death to me just it switches everything up. It just completely
Yeah.
changes the entire narrative.
Hmm.
And the main key there is that these are individuals who have been told they're going to die. This is not something that they are just saying, "Hey, I have cancer. I'm sick of this. I'm done." It's no,
Yep.
you actually have to say, so you have a choice because you're going to die. You have a choice to end it sooner. And because I mean, my God, like I have a dad with multiple sclerosis, and I have seen how that has affected him so much throughout the years. And that hits on your cognition so much as well. And just thinking
Yep.
about, as much as I would never, ever, ever want my dad to go down that route, if it were a situation that he was given, like, this stamp of, hey, you're going to die in 6 months. And by the way, it's going to be awful. And at some point, you're going to lose aspects of your personality. You're going to lose aspects of your autonomy. You're going to lose this. You're going to be on tube feeding and bedridden. Da, 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 da. I would much rather my dad have that choice. And quite frankly, I would
Yeah.
also, as his daughter, I would much rather see him die that way with still himself and still his personality versus the traumatic experience of seeing a parent
Yep.
like in comatose.
Absolutely. That's exactly
Dang.
what I was thinking about. My father was on hospice for cancer, and I went to be with him at the end of his life. They were like, it's an any day now thing. And
Hmm.
Yeah.
there was a couple of weeks we spent, and he was miserable and he was in pain and he hated it. And he kept telling me, I just want to get this over with. And I just kept thinking, like, I don't know how to do that in a legal fashion. I don't know
Hmm.
in my heart. I was like, what do I do? Like, is there something I can do? And I thought everything that I thought I could do sounded like some weird illegal thing where I was killing him at his
Yeah.
wits.
Yeah.
And I just remember being like, is there a thing that I wish that I would have known and thought about all these things and could have discussed this with him in advance because he had to go through it in the worst
Yep.
of the ways. And that's
Yep.
awful.
Yeah.
I
It
was
just
just
sounds like
thinking about, I was
no,
going
you
to
go ahead.
just say my father also died on hospice, and he had a beautiful death. He was on hospice for about a week. We were all there with him, not when he actually died, but, we got to spend time with him and say everything we wanted to say. And it was a beautiful death. And I thank God for hospice. And, so many people have good quality deaths because of hospice. Some people still don't. Some people suffer on hospice. And some people just don't want to do that, just don't want to wither away. So that's why medical aid in dying exists for those people who really want control. I don't think my father would have done it. I think I just don't think he would have, but that's
Mhm.
okay. We don't, my goal is not that everybody uses it. It's just that the option is available if people want it.
Absolutely. Like you said, that bodily autonomy. So,
Yeah.
my next question is actually something that you've already answered, but I think it bears repeating. Is going to ask about how I could see that legalizing something like assisted death could potentially lead to abuse or pressures on a vulnerable population. But it sounds like there's already laws that are set to protect that. So it's not like you're going to have an individual with a severe mental illness who says, well, this is what I want. This is my autonomy. This is my choice. Those aren't even going to be an option for individuals like
It's
that.
not an option, although the opposition will continue to say that that's what they're worried about. And I could understand it like 30 years ago when the first state, which was Oregon, implemented their law, that they thought that there was going to be this slippery slope, that we were going to allow for cancer and ALS, and then for depression, and then for, pain or nausea or something. It just hasn't proven to be the case. The law is really well written. In 30 years, there has not been one substantiated case of abuse or coercion. So now at this point, that argument it kind of falls flat because
Yeah.
we've had 30 years of experience showing us that it doesn't get abused.
Yeah. And you talk about just,
Yeah.
it being a while. Well, I think all of us definitely remember good old Dr. Kevorkian. And so it's not exactly
Yeah.
like this has a good memory for a lot of us who
Yep.
lived during that time in the 90s. It was incredibly
Yes.
controversial. And I think that
Yes.
not only are we having to think about people like, oh my God, well, what about the mentally ill? Well, what Dr. Kevorkian, like I can imagine not weird, but you are still having to probably fight some of that unfortunate messaging that happened 30
Yeah.
years ago.
Yeah. Well, the other thing is that, so again, Kevorkian was different because he was injecting people with medication. So already that is off the table in any state in the United States. So you have to self-ingest the medication. So that's already a safeguard right there. And also the like Governor Hochul actually just added into the New York law, which is the one that I've been advocating for, mandatory competency evaluation. So everyone that wants medical aid in dying in New York will have to meet with a psychiatrist or a psychologist to determine that they are not being coerced and that they know what they're doing. We don't think that that's really necessary because you have two doctors that are already able to tell you that they're competent, but she added in just one more safeguard in New York. So, for people who have that concern.
Yeah, which by the way,
Just
congratulations. I saw that she signed
Thank
I
you.
read an article that on
Mhm.
December 17th, 2025, she signed it. It's called the MAID, the Medical Aid
Yep.
in
She
Dying
didn't
Act.
sign
And
it
yeah,
yet. She
she hasn't signed it though.
announced it
Oh,
on
okay.
December 17th. She announced that she will be signing it and added some amendments. January 12th, our legislative session starts again in New York. So they will come back to session on January 12th, assuming we agree to the amendments that she added. And then she will sign it likely by the end of January, beginning of February. But it's
That's
a big deal.
exciting for you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Congratulations. It's always
Thank
nice to
you.
see your hard work actually like paying off like this. This is
Uh-huh.
awesome.
oh,
10 years of advocacy it took. So a long time coming.
My
thank
God.
goodness, though.
I
Yep.
don't know if I can do anything for 10 years.
I know, right? Oh my goodness. We already have. We've been doing stuff for 10. Uh, so my next question actually also kind of rings home in this, but is about how healthcare professionals how they have to navigate the tension between preserving life and a patient's desire to not do that, is to not be kept alive. And this totally made me actually think about two of the situations where I was helping family members in hospice. But like I had mentioned, like my father was just like, listen, he came to me, he's like, I want this to be done as quickly as possible. And I was like, and I want to help you do that. I don't know how to do that, Dad. Let me figure out how to do that. And the hospice nurse would come by. I remember like one day he had a fever and he had said, I don't want any medications. Don't give me anything, no matter what it is. I don't want it. Just let me go. The only thing he wanted was his pain pump that he was on where he could push the button and get the pain med. So I remember he had a fever one day and his wife at the time, they came by and she said, oh, he has a fever. And she said, give him Tylenol. And I said, don't give him Tylenol. He said he doesn't want anything. He doesn't care. He said no. And I remember feeling for this poor nurse who's like looking back and forth and goes, well, she's the wife. And she said that she wanted it. So I'm going to do it. And I'll never forget. I mean, talk about this exact question. She put it because he was a little bit like, he was like kind of out of it at that point. He was not awake anymore. And she put it in his anus because that was how she needed to submit it. And he screamed.
Hmm.
And I was like, this is the exact reason why he said he didn't want it. You're choosing to do it. How is bringing his temperature down going to assist the fact that he is dying? And I remember saying to him, because he woke up for a little minute there because of this situation, and I whispered in his ear, you can push the button as much as you want. That's the answer, Dad. Push the button as much as you want. I'm going to put it in your hand. It doesn't have a time control. Just push it as much as you want. It's going to make you sleep. I can't do it for you. And I put it in his hand and I put his thumb on it. And he never woke up again. He was on that
Hmm.
little thing until however long that situation happened, until he
Yeah.
passed. This is why I think this is a good question, because I think it's a tough position for people to be in. Had we had a document or something that was like,
Yep.
you can't do it because he signed this, and so
Yep.
yeah. How
So
do
there's
we?
a couple of things that I would say about that.
Oof.
First of all, it's one of the reasons why it's so important to have a healthcare proxy, somebody that you actually trust to advocate on your behalf. So it doesn't have to be your spouse, right? If you think your spouse is not going to be the one that's going to respect your wishes, then pick someone else. So It's so important because once you stop speaking for yourself, the likelihood is that people will treat. They will overtreat rather than undertreat.
Mm.
Having somebody to advocate for you is so important. So that's number one. And it sounds very similar to a situation I had also with my father when he was dying of cancer. He developed an infection and the doctor said, so we're going to give him an antibiotic for the infection. And I said, well, why are we going to give him an antibiotic? And he said, well, he was in the hospital at the time. He said, well, we'll give him an antibiotic so he gets better enough that he can go home on hospice. And I said, so he's dying, like he's this close to death. We'll give him an antibiotic so he could die all over again. Like, I just couldn't see the point in that. And I was like, isn't the fact that he has an infection actually a blessing? Like, it will speed up the dying process rather than
Mm.
prolong the dying process. Because we're not prolonging his life again, we're prolonging
Yeah.
his death. And it just did not make sense to me. So, healthcare proxy and having somebody, I happened to be working in a hospice at the time. So I had some information and a little bit of comfort in having conversations like this. But I remember thinking, like, a lot of people don't. A lot of people don't have, they'd say the doctor says give him an antibiotic. So give him an
Yeah.
antibiotic. Like, of course.
Right.
Man.
The other thing that you mentioned before was about like the tension that healthcare professionals often have. And I think that's sort of a misconception because, we talk about like the Hippocratic Oath, which was, I don't even know when that was created. It was a really long time ago. The AMA, the American Medical Association, their declaration is not about preserving life as much as it is about balancing life with dignity and autonomy. And that's really what we're doing, right? It is not about like, we're all going to die. Like, no one
Yeah.
gets out alive. So we know that. It's really about making sure that a person's wishes and values are respected.
Mhm.
And that is what their oath is it's not about keeping someone alive. It is about, respecting their wishes.
Yeah, but it
Right.
also seems, and this is just kind of where my brain goes, is it almost seems to make do not harm a bit of a gray area in the sense that
A
the
lot.
doctor is saying that, yes, I am saying your wishes are perfectly fine, but your wishes are to die. And your wishes are to die in a means of some type of assistance versus just like palliative care or comfort care where we're putting on you on a medicine and you just kind of progressively go into that. So I just think about just kind of the gray area that do not harm, like you said, the Hippocratic Oath, which has been around for Lord knows how long. I mean, I
Right.
think it's in the name, gives us an idea how old it is. But that just, like, really brings up, like, a head scratcher, and I think about quite frankly, I think about the protections that a doctor
Yeah.
could potentially face with something like this.
Hmm.
Mm,
Well, do no harm. Sometimes keeping someone alive is more harmful than
Yeah.
keeping them, than helping them to die. I just literally hung up the phone with someone this afternoon who was saying that, like, her father, his biggest fear was staying alive. He's like, I am so afraid that I'm going to be kept alive in this situation, that I have no control over my bodily functions, that I'm
Yeah.
not enjoying anything. I know who you are right now, but I am afraid I'm not going to. I don't want to be sitting in a chair drooling. Like, that's not, I'm so afraid of that. And,
Yeah.
the doctor's responsibility at that point is really to make sure that they are not doing that to that person. That is
Yeah.
more harmful to them than helping them to die.
I mean,
care proxy
Yeah.
and advanced healthcare directives. I think after this whole thing happened with my father, and I had saw my grandmother through hospice. I'm like the dying person at my in my family for some reason. Probably mental health. They're like, you deal with that stuff. No, but we were all the family was very much affected by this, and my sister and I, my younger sister and I, who were not near death age or potentially, we were like, listen, something could happen any day. So
Yep.
we are each other's. We filled out advanced healthcare
Good for
directives
you.
because we know that we will respect each other. She goes, my husband will keep me alive on life support, and I don't want it. And I know that you will respect what I
mhm.
say. And I was like, you know what? You're right, and you'll respect what I say. So we filled them out and gave each other a copy and notified our spouses. You're not the one, by the way. Sorry.
Mhm.
You guys aren't the one. It's our
Mhm.
sister. Yeah. And then I just was thinking, now I need a backup because what if she goes before I have to go?
Mhm.
I'm gonna have to call Krista.
I'm here for you because now we're both in the Midwest together. That's close enough, right? So I've mentioned also like palliative care, and I'm just wondering what role do you feel palliative care should play in this discussion? Yeah, if we just had more access to palliative care or comfort, do you feel that it would reduce this desire potentially for assisted death, or do you see them as being like
So
complementary?
definitely complementary, but also maybe it might reduce assisted deaths.
Hmm.
So I feel very strongly that somebody who wants medical aid in dying should be on palliative care or hospice.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful service and often reduces pain. It's not always about pain, why people choose medical aid in dying. So we still want that option available, but it absolutely is complementary. And what we've seen in other states that have implemented medical aid in dying is an increase in palliative care and hospice. So, which is wonderful. New York
Hmm.
actually has one of the lowest rates of hospice utilization in the country. So we are
Interesting.
very excited about medical aid in dying because we are hoping that it actually increases hospice use in the country or in the state. The other thing is many people that want medical aid in dying and go through the whole process, which is arduous, getting two doctors and a written request and an oral request. And in New York, they're going to have to get a psychiatric eval, and the medication is expensive and not covered by insurance. And they do all of that. Many of
Hmm.
them choose not to do it in the end. So sometimes just knowing that it's available to them is really comforting. But
Yeah.
we need hospice and palliative care to be there because many of them actually choose not to do it. So we want
Yeah.
that comfort care, in place for people at the end of their lives.
People want choices.
That's it. They just want choices.
Yeah.
Yep. I had a friend visiting from England recently, and all she wanted to do was go to the grocery store because she said it's so like exciting to go to the grocery store in the States. Because in England, she said you go in, there's three cereals, there's, one kind of rice, there's no prepared food. She's like, I just love seeing the choices. She's like literally, she's on vacation in the United States and she wants to just walk through aisles at the grocery store because she just felt so good seeing choices.
That makes sense, actually.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Having shopped in some other countries, I definitely like lead me back to where the cheese is already shredded. I don't want it shredded.
exactly.
I have time for
She was
that.
having the most fun looking through like the Pop Tarts, like all of these flavors of Pop Tarts.
Oh my gosh. Well, and how do you think, I mean, not that we can speak to every cultural or religious belief, but how do you think overall, just some cultural or religious beliefs might affect attitudes
Mhm.
towards, medical
Yeah.
assisted?
So I'm going to say, of course they do. The Catholic Church is probably our biggest opponent of, medical aid in dying. Although most Catholics actually support it. It's the church that doesn't, but most Catholics actually support it. It's just sort of similar to abortion, right?
Interesting.
The church is not supportive of abortion, but most Catholics actually agree that abortion should be legal.
Hmm.
So but the good news and the reason that I feel like that's totally fine is because
Hmm.
no one has to participate. So no one has to avail themselves of this option if they feel like they're religious, moral, ethical, academic, whatever their reasons are, they do not have to avail themselves of this option.
Hmm.
Doctors don't have to prescribe medication if they're not comfortable doing that. Chaplains don't have to do it, social workers, pharmacists, no one has to participate if they are uncomfortable, and patients. So if you don't want to do this, don't do it.
Hmm.
So, if you have, like I said, speak to your clergy members, speak to your mentors, whoever it is that you feel like is valuable to you and you trust, we encourage you to do that. And then do whatever it is that feels right for you. I mentioned before, I want to die, in my bed with my family. I know other people that say, throw the book at me. I want everything done. Keep me alive at all costs. I would not want that. But if that is what you want, I want that for you too. We want
Mhm.
the whole range of options available to people, whatever their beliefs are.
Something that I just thought about is because you had mentioned like the Catholic thing, like, the church is against it, but you're seeing some like parishioners and dioceses that are okay with it. And it's
Mhm.
very much the opposite where I am. And so I think about, let's say that somebody where I'm at would like that as an option. The dioceses around here are not for that. Maybe there's some parishioners, sure, because now not, it's not like everybody is the exact same. Would they have the option to be able to go up to these states? What is it? Oregon, Washington, and soon New York. Would they be able, or do they actually have to be a resident of these states?
So, unfortunately, in New York, we had advocated for a bill that did not have a residency requirement. Governor Hochul has amended that to add a residency requirement. There are two states in this country that do not have residency requirements, Oregon and Vermont. New York would have been better just because it's a much more accessible state, lots of flights, lots of airports, lots of doctors. So it would have been easier. We don't know exactly yet what a resident means. So the definition of a resident looks different across lots of states. So some states, when it says you have to be a resident, that means you have to live there for a year. You have to have a voter registration, a driver's license. Other states, a resident is someone who walks into the state and says, I live here now. So we're not sure yet what it means to be a resident of New York. And we are hoping that it is a pretty inclusive definition so that people from across the country that need it will be able to avail themselves of the medical care. That's excellent medical care in New York. And it's literally the only kind of medical care that you have to be a resident for. I lived in New Jersey for many, many years and availed myself of the quality care in New York several times. My father, who died from cancer, availed himself of Sloan Kettering in New York many times. So our hope is that they will be able to get this quality care in New York as well at some point.
Yeah, like you talk about just even the time restrictions that if the residency is 1 year, but to even qualify, they have to have gotten this terminal diagnosis for 6 months. Like that,
Yeah.
the math is not mathing. It doesn't make any
No.
sense in
Well,
that
you could be
particular
diagnosed
situation.
with cancer and they could say
Hmm.
to you, like, this is going to kill you in 3 years. But, most people, myself included, couldn't afford to just pick up, move, buy an apartment in New York City, find doctors, especially when you're dying. I mean, it is, an arduous task. And if you're really sick, the travel alone is difficult. And New York is obviously not a cheap state to live in.
Yeah, and if there's ever an illness, a disease, a syndrome, or whatever that is more bankrupting than cancer, I mean, please tell me. So I can't imagine somebody saying, "Well, I have cancer, so I think I'm going to move to New York because it's so affordable and I can afford this disease I have." Like, no.
And also, like, don't you want to, again, everybody wants, their own death, but most
Yeah,
people want to die in their own home, surrounded by their own family with their cat. And,
absolutely.
like they don't want to go to some strange place and die. There was a family we worked
Hmm.
with recently. They went to Oregon. So they lived in New York and they went to Oregon. The wife was an interior decorator and she decorated, they built a home from the ground up. Every single brick in that house, every pillow, every paint color, she picked. And she couldn't die there. So all she wanted was to die there. And she had to go to Oregon and die in a place that was unfamiliar and, not surrounded by her things that she loved so much. And that's just so unfortunate.
Wow. You bring up family, and I'm wondering, so for families, of course, the decision is very emotional. There's so many thoughts and emotion. There's just a lot that comes with that. And I'm
Yeah.
wondering what kinds of conversations should loved ones have long before even, this is an option.
Yeah. So we host these things, we call them legacy leagues. And that's really like they're online sometimes they're in person, but they're just like kind of hang out and talk about death and dying because we know it's really hard to have these conversations. But that's our goal is to normalize this, really difficult conversation. My suggestion is always to start early while you're young and healthy. And that's
Yeah.
not to say like, you're young and healthy, so let's sit down and have a conversation about my death. There's so many opportunities. People die every single day in the news. You watch something on TV, you watch a movie. So there's always these opportunities that you could say, "Oh, God, did you see how that happened in the movie?" Or with that person that just died on the news. Like, if that was me, this is what I would want. Or like, I hope I die just like that person did. So use current events, use, media outlets to start conversations. There's also, there's games. There's a game called the Death Deck. They're like little cards where you could just, put them out on your coffee table and, you just pull a card. There's a game that I have. It doesn't exist anymore, but I have the old game, and they're, like I said, they're like little prompts. If you were to die, would you want your death announced on Facebook? If you were
Mm,
lost at sea, who would you want to determine how long they're going to look for you? So they just sort of like get you talking. I hope that somebody that's listening to this podcast goes home tonight and says, God, I was listening to this podcast about death and dying, and it made me think about what I want my last meal to be. And by the way, if I know I'm dying, I want my last meal to be whatever. So I hope that people start using sort of everyday opportunities to have these conversations. It's, just like we do with our kids and sex and
yeah.
money and, all of those kinds of things. If
You
it's
know,
too late for that because you've been diagnosed with an illness, it's time to sit down and say, we need to have a conversation. And there's some forms, you can find them on our website, that you can fill out. They're free, downloadable, and start the conversation that way.
love it.
We
By the
will
way,
be
when you
listening.
mentioned you mentioned Death Deck, I could tell Tracie was. I wrote it down because I'm like,
I know
"Ooh."
you guys ready.
I did. I'm going to engage my kids in a conversation around death tech. You better believe it. Because I've had
Absolutely.
conversation, and I think they think I'm joking, but I never joke. I'm like, don't put me in
Yep.
a nursing home. Don't do this. I'm like,
Yep.
and they joke. They're like, you like high places. Maybe we'll take you to a high cliff. I'm like, no, honestly, that sounds excellent. I'm like, no, really, like,
Yep.
really take me to that cliff. I really want
Yep.
to go to that cliff
Yep.
because
I love the Death Deck because it's like a game, and it doesn't have to be like, Sunday afternoon, we have to have the conversation. Like, you could just play a game, and it really does get the conversation started.
I
Anybody
love
that knows
this.
me knows I own so many of those, like, we're not really strangers or we're not really friends or just whatever. Those, I love icebreaker questions. And this one, thank you for that, Mandy.
You're
I like
welcome.
this is like our new thing. I'm gonna play this constantly, compulsively. Eventually, I'm like, do you remember the choice? How long if I'm at sea? Child number 2. How long? Wrong. You looked for me 3 months too long. That was now we have
Okay.
to take notes because I'm serious. I do not want to go through this crazy
Yep.
stuff.
Yep.
So, with advances in medicine, not a lot of advances, but some advances in medicine and technology that can extend life, do you think that society needs to rethink what it means to live well versus to stay alive? Because I think people think a lot about just longevity, but
I
what
know.
about living well?
I absolutely do. There have been a lot of really great advances. Our life expectancy is, much longer than it was 50 years ago. But with that does come risk. So, again, living versus dying slower is different. You know, I always say you don't want to outlive your life. And sometimes we do that. We outlive the life
Mhm.
part. So, again, really why it's important to have conversations about your values. What matters to you? What is a quality life? When is life no longer worth living for you? And that, for you, it might be, until I can't, I have to be able to eat chocolate ice cream after dinner. If I can't have chocolate ice cream every night, it's not worth living. For someone else, it could be, riding my bike or recognizing my family or, whatever it is. So, thinking about those kinds of conversations is really important and what your own values are.
Yeah, I love that. I love that.
Yeah,
Goodness
that's
gracious,
absolutely
learning so many
beautiful.
things today.
I know. I have really, really enjoyed this conversation. And unfortunately, we have one more question for you. But I'm not
Uh-oh.
going to lie, I could probably spend so much more time talking to you because this is just
Yeah.
so
That's
fascinating. Like I said, I knew this was going to be a conversation that was going to just kind of change my perspective when it comes to assisted death. And gosh, I can't tell you. I'm going to be sitting on that for a minute about just that vocabulary change because
Yeah.
it changes
Good.
so much. It changes so much. But
yes.
so if you could redesign how society handles death and dying, thinking about legally, medically, culturally, what would that
Yeah.
system look like for you?
It's a good question. I don't necessarily know. I haven't had all the answers today. I don't necessarily have the answer. I think I would love for death to be less medical. It used to be people died at home, funerals were at home, and, there's an industry now around death and dying. And I wish we could sort of bring it back to the people, make death less scary. I think we've removed so much of that from our everyday lives that death has become so scary and taboo. And I wish we could bring some of that normalization. It's just part of life, just like birth and graduations and marriages and retirements. It's just one more transition. And I wish we can, refocus on the fact that it's a normal part. There was a 100% mortality rate and, we're not avoiding it. So avoid talking about it does not make, avoidance of death.
Makes sense. And that
Yeah.
fits really well with
Mhm.
an episode we did previously with the modern mortician, talking about
Oh,
taking the scary out of death and
yeah.
the ways that just bringing it back to the reality of like people die. What if you just make it less weird, um,
Yes.
and
Yep.
more natural and less procedural?
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
I feel like
That would be my wish.
these episodes sort of like really enhance each other because they're really
Yeah, they really do.
talking
I was
about
thinking about
Yeah.
that as well.
Yeah.
yeah. I
I
love
love
that.
the modern mortician.
Yeah, me too. Well, this has been actually absolutely fabulous, and
Yes.
Thank you.
I hope that so many people listen to this, watch this. We're going to link End of Life Choices in New York in this or when we post it, obviously,
Excellent.
so people can come to your website. And what kind of good things can they find on your website?
Well, lots of information about end of life, advanced care planning, certainly some good information about, medical aid and dying and the laws in New York. But also, there's a lot of online things that we offer. So, like I said, the legacy leagues, you can do those online. We offer like free tutorials on how to fill out your advanced care plans. So actually, our website is pretty new. It's about 6 months old, and we are pretty proud of it, if I may say so myself. It was a real labor of love. So I encourage people to come check it out, hang out there, look for information. It's much more accessible than it had been. So if you can't find something, I would be surprised, but feel free to reach out. We're happy to answer questions or, show you where something is. So
Exciting. I'm
yeah,
100% signing up for a legacy league. I want to go.
excellent.
I want to
We would
talk
love
about
to have you.
Yeah, this has absolutely
this.
just been fascinating. So, one of the things that we do at the end of each episode is we talk about a taboo fact. And I bring a taboo fact to the end of the episodes, completely random, but try to kind of make sense to the thing that we're talking about. And so, this is a fact about death. And I love historical stuff, especially when it comes to, quite frankly, death and dying. Humans have done some weird stuff, and this is the one that I have found today is in the 19th century, several inventors came up with safety coffins. It was equipped with bells and air tubes, and it was designed to help people avoid being buried alive, one of my worst fears of all time. And apparently, this is something that continues somewhat. There's moderations today. However, one of the things that we do a lot more today that they didn't back then is we talk, we communicate with people.
Wow. Yeah. I guess you have to add to your advanced air directive. Ensure I'm actually
Yes.
died before.
Make sure I'm dead.
Yeah. I thought that was a guaranteed part, but I guess not. Woo!
You would think so. You
Very.
would think so. But
Yeah.
I mean, even when we talked with the modern mortician, we had said, "Do people mess this up?" And she said, "Yes, every once in a while it happens. It's rare, but yes." But again, because we have the communication, is nobody's getting buried this way, so we're good there.
Yes. Okay.
I don't
But there. Well,
I don't
Good
thank
need to
to
you
know.
again
talk
so
it.
much. Thank you again so much, Mandy. This has
Yes,
been
thank you.
delightful
You're
and
welcome.
so
Thank you.
informative.
I'm so glad that we got to have this talk. Thank you very much for having
Yes.
me.
Thank you so much.